Hey everybody, thanks for tuning into TestTube Plus today. This is episode 3 of 5 on our series about the big man upstairs, or men upstairs, or women, or, everybody. God. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about where these stories of God come from. If you haven't tuned into TestTube Plus before, we take a big topic and we break it into a bunch of little pieces so we all get it a little better. Yesterday and the day before, we've talked about how science and God might get along and how science and God might not get along. So make sure you check those out and subscribe if you haven't already. But where did stories of God come from? Pre-organized forms of religion generally centered on rituals and ancestor worship. Shamanism and animism, which is the worship of nature, saying this rock has a spirit, that tree has a spirit. Various rituals are speculated to have taken place around 300,000 years ago. Cavemen buried their dead in a group. Why would they do that? Unless they want to go visit. And why would you visit dead people unless you think they're either A, still there, or B, could go somewhere else? And this was a way to memorialize them. Rituals like these have been practiced since at least 100,000 years BCE. The word religion comes from the Latin religio, which is to unite oneself with the supreme. The oldest religion still in practice today is Hinduism. Why? That's a mystery. Religions come and go, usually in popularity, usually shifting with culture as that changes, but Hinduism has survived for quite a long time. Some of the first religious records come from Egypt around 4000 BCE. The Egyptians were polytheistic. There were more than 100 gods in Egyptian culture. They had Ra, the sun god. They had Osiris, god of the pharaohs. They had Isis, the god who makes the crops grow. There's a lot of intermarrying and mingling between all of these different gods. It's crazy. So much stuff going on, and you had to know all of them if you wanted to get into the afterlife. The Egyptians were conquered by the Persians in 525 BC, and they adopted some of their religious practices. And then they were conquered by the Greeks in 323 BC, who were Orthodox, and adopted some of their practices. And the Egyptians worshipped some of the Greek gods, but still worshipped their own gods. So then it just gets more complicated. Then the Romans conquered Egypt in 30 BC, and the Egyptians kept on worshiping their own gods, and they were also worshiping some Greek gods, and then they had some Roman gods in there. It's kind of a mess. Their religion changed over time, obviously, but the baseline of it, the cement floor of that, persisted. The earliest written form of the Germanic word God comes from the 6th century. Christian Codex Argentis had it written in there, and it was probably meant as God as we think of it now. And it was a genderless word originally. It didn't mean God a man. It didn't get to be masculine until later on. As Christianity developed with the early Germanic people, they started to think of God as a male figure. But originally it was neutral. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking ancient religions, you're thinking hundreds of gods, you're thinking Egyptians and Romans and all of these weird rituals, and you're probably thinking about druids and all sorts of stuff. So that kind of, a lot of times, puts people down a path toward drugs and connection to the religion and the religious experience. And you know what? I totally get that. This idea has been discussed extensively since the middle of the 20th century. In 1979, a group dedicated to the study of the relationship between people and plants created the term entheogen, literally meaning that which causes God to be within an individual, which kind of sounds like pot logic to me. I don't know about you. But there is some evidence that drugs enhance religious experiences, and there are some evidences from around native cultures that drugs are used in those ways. There was a study done in the 1960s at Marsh Chapel at Boston University confirming some of these theories about how God is connected to hallucinogens. You can look that up on your own. We didn't want to get down that rabbit hole. But we might also just be predisposed to believe that there's a higher power out there, right? Perhaps it's part of our biology. Think back to those cavemen burying people hundreds of thousands of years ago in groups. Kids who don't have exposure to religion tend to blame what we would call external forces, and they imagine that everything has a purpose. We are born to try and decide purpose when we're doing things. In one study, children were asked whether their mother would know the contents of a box that was closed. The mom did not know what was in there, but they asked the children if she would. And the children, who were aged 3, they believed their mother and God would always know the contents of a box, even if they'd never looked inside. because we think of our parents and we think of our gods as these kind of omniscient beings. We're kind of built to do that. Additional research showed that children prefer purpose-based explanations. They were asked why rocks were pointed, for example, and they chose answers that implied the rocks were pointed for a purpose, like they were pointed so birds could sit on them. Every time you found an arrowhead in the woods when you were a kid, it was probably not an arrowhead. But because the rock was a point, you thought, oh, it's an arrowhead. Somebody made this an arrowhead. When in reality, sometimes rocks are just pointy. Does this show that we're programmed to see a design in the world? Maybe. Maybe it does. Maybe we're all just optimists. That's awesome. But we're hardwired to believe in things outside of ourselves, like religion and God. Some would say that that is evidence that God exists, and some would say the exact opposite. It's evidence that we're making this God stuff up. But we're going to talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. So do we need God? Or is it just one of those human things? Subscribe so you can come back and see that episode tomorrow. And tell us down in the comments if you grew up going to church. And let me know how much you loved it or hated it. Maybe you still go. Tell me why. Subscribe for more TestTube Plus, like I said, and hopefully you liked this episode. If you did, make sure you watch the other episodes in this series that we've done so far. And thank you for tuning in to TestTube Plus.